Hello everyone, my name is Autumn Lake and I am part of the Master's in Educational Technology program at Michigan State University. I'm currently in a class that is requiring us to do something kind of interesting to experiment with technology and how we can use it in our classroom. So our assignment was to limit ourselves to using only YouTube and help forums in order to teach ourselves a new skill over the course of 5 or so weeks. During this process, I decided that I was going to take on learning part of a new language, obviously not becoming fluent as I only have 5 weeks to complete this, but I wanted to start the process of learning Spanish. So I decided that I was going to limit myself to approximately the first 150 phrases of the most common things that people learn to speak in Spanish, or the most useful phrases for beginners. I found a YouTube video that was actually called 150 Spanish Phrases for Beginners, and then I supplemented that with some other YouTube videos that were specifically geared towards the introductory phrases or phrases about food, and just to help me better understand some alternatives. During this process, I have found that learning a language using YouTube is quite difficult. I think I was able to get a grasp on what it sounded like and how to pick up what people were saying using context of a few words that I do remember. But overall, I don't think that it's the best way to go about preparing yourself for a trip overseas. I don't feel extremely confident in what I've learned, or being able to walk into a conversation and really hold my own even with these 150 phrases. It was a lot to try to process in 5 weeks, and lacking the other side of the conversation to give me feedback on how it sounded, if I was doing it correctly, to answer my questions and kind of get the conversational flow, made it really difficult for me to gauge how successful I was at the different points in the process, and then to go back and make changes and critique myself was kind of just up to me and listening and attempting to emulate what I heard as much as possible. So with that, I would like to give you a little bit of a taste of what I have learned, because it was fun, even if it wasn't 100% successful. I do feel like it was an interesting thing to try. So I started with phrases that were specifically geared towards introductions, getting to know you kind of things. Some of these I already knew just through cartoons that my kid watched, or I guess just overhearing it in conversations over the years. There's the typical hola. Then it did give 2 different versions of the how are you. There's a formal and informal. I felt that I wanted to stick with all of the formal phrases that they offered instead of trying to learn 2 versions of everything, just because that way I feel like I would always be safe. It's always better to be more formal in any given situation, kind of like being overdressed rather than underdressed. So I went with the como está, and then adding the S to the end. The como estás would be the informal version of how are you. And then it went through a bunch of different ways that you can respond to that if that was asked of you, which would be like I'm fine, estoy bien. You could also go through and then ask y tú or y usted, which was formal and informal, and you, to kind of bring the question back to them. The introduction part of it was interesting because they gave 2 different versions, and one of them I remember hearing before, but then it was strange. So me llamo, and then your name, me llamo Autumn, would be I call myself Autumn, and that's the one that I've always heard most often, but doesn't make the most sense now that I've heard the translation of it. I just always assumed that it was my name is, but my name is actually mi nombre es Autumn, and that would be I believe now, probably the more common version. Now, again, these are all questions that I have developed while learning this because I don't get that feedback during the process, and really just got to hear, here's the phrase, and then they would read it back to me a few times, and then they would give the translation, and then they'd move on to the next thing. So there wasn't a lot of support material in there, and I didn't have access to any sort of instructor to ask these questions about when it's appropriate to use these different phrases. And then they also went through greetings based on time of day. So you have buenos dias for good day, buenos tardes for good afternoon, and buenas noches for good night. I feel like I got a good enough grasp that even in my pretty awful English accent that I'd be able to give these greetings and at least initiate a conversation using Spanish, and somebody that is native to those countries would be able to understand what I was saying, which is kind of the most basic goal I had of learning these 150 phrases. Now, there were some more that they went into that I felt were pretty exciting because they were specific to being a student, and I thought that that was neat. So some of the phrases that they mentioned were like, what are you studying? What's your phone number? I live in the United States. So then kind of breaking that boundary of, I may be speaking Spanish, but it's not my first language. Yeah, so the interesting what are you studying question, while it gave me the question, it really didn't give any sort of responses. So if somebody were to ask me that question, or even if I was to ask them, I wouldn't really know what their response would be or what it would mean. But the are you studying, or what are you studying, was ¿qué está estudiando?, which I used in the title of my second blog post about this whole process, because I thought that it was neat that it was school related, and it gave me a little bit of a path into what I was talking about on my blog. So I didn't make it through the 150 phrases. It took me quite a bit of repeating back and forth on just the first 50. And then I started getting to about 75 total. So I made it halfway to my goal in 5 weeks, which was a little disappointing, but it was extremely helpful for me as an educator to be able to see what this process would be like. I would definitely recommend learning something on YouTube. I've actually done it before for other things like assembling something or cooking, and I felt like that was a little bit easier to grasp and to understand using just a one-way type of communication. Language, I think it's just way too difficult to learn and practice alone. Language is a form of communication that is typically shared between two people, whether it's on the phone, over video, Skype, or in person. And so to do it by yourself, you really don't get that practice and the practical application that you need in order to become fluent and to truly understand what you're doing. So I think for other situations, YouTube would be fantastic, and I do plan on utilizing it in my classroom quite a bit. But in this instance, I don't think it was really successful, and I probably won't go this route to continue my Spanish education. While it is still a life goal of mine, I don't think I'll be doing it through YouTube. So I really want to thank you all for following my blog and following my entire journey through this, and I hope that you continue to follow along and see what other things I'm up to. Thanks.